to produce its kind is a characteristic of all living organisms. You have already learnt this in Class 6. The production of new individuals from their parents is known as reproduction.
Like spores, some plants can also survive unfavorable conditions. Under such conditions, the aerial parts of a plant usually die, but the underground parts like root or stem remain dormant or inactive. When conditions are favorable again, these dormant parts grow again to produce a new plant. Similar is the case with colocasia, sweet potato, etc., which don't produce any seeds. Thus, when new plants are produced from parts of the parent plant, such as the root, stem, or leaves, without the help of any reproductive organs, it is known as vegetative propagation. Vegetative propagation can be done by a stem, root, and leaves.
Vegetative propagation and its types. Asexual reproduction in higher plants is called vegetative propagation. Now, let's discuss the different methods of vegetative propagation. Natural methods of vegetative propagation includes propagation by leaves, for example, in Bryophyllum and Begonia. Propagation by stem, for example, in grass, strawberry, and potato. Propagated by roots, for example, in sweet potato and dahlia. The artificial methods of vegetative propagation include stem cutting, for example, in strawberry, grafting, for example, in rose, etc., and layering, for example, in grapes.
In this method, a new plant is produced from the branch of rose containing the node called cutting. Cutting of a plant is buried under soil and is watered regularly. After 1 week, roots come out. After 2 weeks, stem with new leaflets arises, and after the 3rd week, the flower bud develops into a complete flower. Vegetative propagation of potato. Here we take a potato with scars on its surface called as eyes. Now, cut a small piece with scar from the potato and bury it in the soil. After regular watering, a new plant of potato emerges. Likewise, you can also carry out vegetative propagation in other plants like ginger, etc. Vegetative propagation by leaves. In plants like Bryophyllum and Begonia, new plants are produced from leaves which have buds on the notches in their margins. These buds, after falling on the ground or coming in contact with the soil, grow into new plants. Thus, a new plant with proper root and shoot system can grow from a bud. Dahlia and sweet potato have roots that help in vegetative propagation. If root tuber of sweet potato is cut into pieces and sown in well-prepared soil, a new plant can be produced. Weeds like dandelion are capable of regenerating into a new plant even if some parts of its root are left behind in the soil. In some plants, a side branch grows out of the main plant and a root grows down into the soil. The stem grows in length and creeps along the ground, runners, and forms roots at intervals, thus forming new plants. When the new plant has grown enough, the link between the old and the new plant withers away. For example, some species of grass and strawberry. Some plants reproduce vegetatively beneath the soil and are called modified underground stems. For example, onion, potato, ginger, colocasia, etc., and are called modified underground stems. Budding. In yeast, a unicellular organism, a little cytoplasm accumulates at one end of the cell. The nucleus of the parent cell divides into two and one is sent into the bud. Bud formation occurs very rapidly in yeast cells. To form a chain of yeast cells under favorable conditions, all these chains of buds don't detach from the parent individual, so a sort of colony is formed. Here, we take yeast powder and pour it in a beaker containing water. Now, add some sugar in it and stir it. Cover the beaker with a bell jar for some time. After an hour, take a drop of water from the beaker with the help of a dropper on a slide and observe it under the microscope. Here we observe budding in the yeast cells. These small projections coming out are called buds. Fragmentation. There are several filamentous organisms like Pyrogyra or flatworm that increase their population by fragmenting their filaments. The organism breaks up into two or more fragments after maturation, and each fragment starts growing into a new individual. Spore formation. During unfavorable conditions, many fungi, mushrooms, ferns, mosses, and bacteria such as yeast, rhizopus, and mucor reproduce through spore formation. A spore is a tiny spherical unicellular body protected by a hard and thick wall. Spores are a microscopic structure that help in overcoming conditions unfavorable for reproduction. In this mode of reproduction, living organisms repair and grow the lost parts of their body. Plants and some organisms such as hydra and flatworm regenerate their lost body parts.
It is spring season. Flowers are blooming on the trees. It is indeed a beautiful sight. Flowers attract all of us. They are the most beautiful part of the plant, isn't it? You already know that flowers are not present only to add beauty to the plant. They are in fact the reproductive part of the plant. In the flower, stamen is the male reproductive part, while carpel is the female reproductive part. Some flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called bisexual flowers. For example, pea, China rose, etc. On the other hand, some flowers possess either the male or the female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called unisexual flowers. For example, corn, cucumber, etc. Now let us know about the different parts that make up a stamen and a carpel. A stamen is made of two main parts, anther and filament. The anther produces pollen grains. It is the pollen grain that contains the male gametes. A carpel, on the other hand, is made up of three parts. The terminal part is called the stigma. The middle elongated part is the style, and the swollen bottom part is the ovary. Inside the ovary, ovules are present. It is the ovule that has the female gamete called the egg cell. For sexual reproduction to take place, a male gamete is to be fused with the female gamete, thereby forming a zygote. Now for that, the male gametes have to reach the female gametes. For this, first a pollen grain carrying the male gametes is transferred from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same or the other flower. Such transfer of pollen grains is known as pollination. If the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of the same flower, It is called self-pollination. But if the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of another flower of the same or another plant of the same type, it is called cross-pollination. Pollination occurs with the help of different agents like wind, water, or animals. Once a pollen grain reaches the stigma of a suitable flower, a tube grows from the pollen grain. This tube travels through the style and reaches the ovary. The male gamete from the pollen travels in this tube and reaches to the female gamete present in the ovule of the ovary. After that, the male and the female gamete fuse together to form the zygote. This process of fusion of male and female gametes is called fertilization. The zygote formed after the fertilization then divides several times to form an embryo inside the ovule. The ovule develops a tough coat and changes to a seed. The ovary, on the other hand, ripens and forms a fruit around the seed. At this time, the other parts of the flower, like the sepals and petals, fall off. So, a seed present inside a fruit contains an embryo, which is actually a baby plant. Each time a seed is planted in soil and provided appropriate conditions, it grows into a seedling, which then